December 1944, Western Germany. A gray dawn settles over a frozen road network choked with mud, fuel trucks, and steel. From a low ridge, a German infantry officer watches armored columns pass through the mist. They do not rush. They do not pause. Tank after tank moves forward at a steady, mechanical pace. Olive drab hulls streaked with grime, white stars dulled by winter dust. When one vehicle breaks down, another slides past it. When a bridge is damaged, engineers are already laying steel mats across the gap. There is no dramatic breakthrough, no single decisive machine, only repetition and scale. For years, German planners had dismissed American industry as inefficient, soft, and untested. Yet here, on roads leading east, the evidence moves on tracks. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands, part of a flow that does not stop. The realization spreads quietly along the line. This war is no longer about winning battles. It is about surviving production. In the years before the war, German confidence in industrial superiority rested on experience rather than measurement. By 1939, Germany had rearmed at a pace that astonished Europe. Its factories produced advanced aircraft, tanks, optics, and artillery in quantities sufficient to defeat Poland in weeks and France in days. The Wehrmacht's victories seemed to confirm a core belief inside German military culture. Modern war was decided by skill, initiative, and technical refinement, not by raw volume. The United States did not fit that model. To German planners, America appeared distant, commercially obsessed, and strategically naive. Its army ranked far below those of Europe in size. Its tank force was negligible. Its military budget before 1940 reflected isolation rather than readiness. German intelligence reports described vast factories producing automobiles and refrigerators, not weapons. Adolf Hitler himself repeatedly dismissed the American system as chaotic and inefficient, arguing that a society built around consumer comfort could not adapt to the discipline of total war. These assumptions hardened after the fall of France. In the summer of 1940, Germany stood undefeated on the continent. Britain was under aerial assault. The Soviet Union was still bound by a non-aggression pact. From Berlin, American industry seemed irrelevant, too far away, too slow, too politically divided to matter in time. Even when President Franklin Roosevelt began expanding arms production through the Lend-Lease program, many German officers viewed it as symbolic rather than decisive. Weapons, they believed, were only useful if paired with doctrine and experience, both of which the U.S. lacked. German tank doctrine reinforced this confidence. Panzer units emphasized combined arms, aggressive maneuver, and battlefield initiative. Crews were highly trained. Officers were expected to think independently. Quality mattered more than quantity because battles were expected to be short and decisive. A smaller number of superior machines, well led, would break the enemy before numbers could accumulate. Yet this mindset carried a blind spot. Germany's own industrial base, though sophisticated, was limited by geography, resources, and fragmentation. Factories were specialized, not standardized. Production runs were small. Design changes were frequent. Efficiency was sacrificed for refinement. This worked when wars ended quickly. It failed when wars dragged on. By 1941, that failure was already beginning to surface. The invasion of the Soviet Union consumed men and machines at a rate German planners had never anticipated. Tank losses mounted. Replacement schedules slipped. For the first time, German officers began encountering an enemy willing to trade space and equipment for time. Still, the United States remained a distant abstraction, a future problem, not a present one. That illusion would not survive the factories now beginning to retool across an ocean. While German planners underestimated American capacity, the United States was already reframing the war in fundamentally different terms. For Washington, the central question was not how to win the next battle, but how to sustain a conflict measured in years. The solution was not tactical brilliance, it was production. Long before American troops landed in combat zones, the groundwork for industrial mobilization was being laid. The United States possessed advantages no European power could match: vast natural resources, a protected homeland, and a civilian economy already optimized for mass production. Automobile factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago operated on assembly line principles refined over decades. Standardization, not perfection, was the guiding logic. A product that could be built quickly, repaired easily, and replaced immediately was considered superior to one that was flawless but scarce. This philosophy shaped American armored doctrine from the outset. When the U.S. Army evaluated its early tank designs, it did not ask whether they could outgun every potential enemy. It asked whether they could be produced by the tens of thousands, shipped across oceans, maintained by average crews, and returned to service rapidly after damage. The result was the M4 Sherman, a tank designed as part of a system rather than a standalone weapon. By 1941, as war spread across multiple continents, American factories began converting at unprecedented speed. Automobile plants stopped producing civilian cars. Tooling was redesigned. Workers were retrained. Within months, production lines that once built sedans were turning out armored hulls, engines, transmissions, and turrets. The process was not improvisational. It was planned, measured, and relentlessly scaled. The numbers soon defied comparison. Where German tank production was counted in the hundreds per month, American output climbed into the thousands. Variants were simplified, components were interchangeable, breakdowns were anticipated and planned for. A damaged Sherman was not a catastrophe, it was a logistical problem with a timetable. Equally important was the mindset this created among American planners. Losses were expected. Crews were trained to abandon disabled vehicles and survive, knowing replacements would arrive. Tanks were not irreplaceable assets to be preserved at all costs. They were consumable tools within a broader industrial machine. This approach extended beyond factories. Shipping schedules, fuel supply, spare parts, and training pipelines were synchronized with production output. Every Sherman rolling off an assembly line already had a place in a system designed to absorb loss and continue moving forward. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence began to notice the scale of American output, but by the time the figures were taken seriously, the machines were already moving. And once they reached the battlefield, they would be encountered not as individual tanks, but as an unending presence. American armored warfare did not begin with a belief in superiority. It began with acceptance of limitations. U.S. planners understood early that their tanks would meet enemy machines that were heavier, more heavily armed, and often better protected. The response was not to chase perfection, but to build something that could exist everywhere at once. The Sherman's design reflected this compromise. Its gun was sufficient rather than dominant. Its armor was adequate rather than impenetrable. Its real strength lay in reliability, ease of manufacture, and the ability to keep moving after others failed. This industrial logic shaped the human experience inside the tank. American crews were trained with the expectation that vehicles would be lost. Survival mattered more than preserving equipment. Escape hatches were emphasized. Fire suppression systems were improved. Damaged tanks were abandoned, repaired, or replaced without ceremony. The emotional bond between crew and machine was different from that found in German units, where scarcity fostered attachment and caution. In American formations, continuity came not from the tank, but from the unit's ability to reconstitute itself repeatedly. On the German side,
The encounter with this philosophy unfolded slowly and uneasily. Early engagements reinforced confidence. Panzer crews found that one-on-one, their tanks could often destroy a Sherman at range. Reports from North Africa and Italy described American armor as inferior in firepower and armor protection. These assessments were technically accurate, yet they missed what mattered most. Every destroyed Sherman was replaced, often within days, sometimes within hours. The battlefield was not empty, it was refilled. German officers began to notice a pattern that defied traditional measures of success. Tactical victories did not translate to operational relief. A successful ambush might eliminate several tanks, only to be followed by renewed pressure along the same axis. There was no sense of attrition working in Germany's favor. Instead, losses accumulated on one side, while the other absorbed them and advanced regardless. Leadership faced an internal contradiction. Publicly, propaganda continued to emphasize technical superiority and heroic resistance. Privately, reports described an enemy whose strength was not concentrated in elite formations, but diffused across logistics, training pipelines, and factories thousands of miles away. The Sherman was no longer evaluated as a vehicle, it was understood as a symptom. Technology, too, took on a different meaning. German engineers responded with heavier tanks, more powerful guns, and increasingly complex designs. Each improvement came at the cost of production speed, reliability, and maintainability. The battlefield became a testing ground for machines that could win engagements, but not wars. In contrast, American industry refined processes rather than weapons. Modifications were incremental. Standardization was preserved. The flow continued. For German soldiers at the front, the effect was psychological as much as physical. The constant presence of enemy armor eroded the sense of progress. There was no moment of recovery, no pause in pressure. Even retreats brought no relief, as the same silhouettes reappeared on new roads, in new villages, under new skies. By the time this realization spread beyond frontline units, the war had already shifted from contest to calculation, and soon the arithmetic of production would overwhelm every other factor. By late 1943, the transformation became impossible to ignore. American tank production had reached a level that rewrote the practical limits of warfare. Assembly lines operated day and night. Output was measured not in individual vehicles, but in monthly totals that exceeded entire German annual production runs. Shermans were leaving factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania faster than they could be shipped overseas. Ports expanded, convoys multiplied. Losses at sea were absorbed without altering delivery schedules. The effect was felt simultaneously across multiple fronts. In Italy, American armored units returned to action weeks after being mauled in difficult terrain. In the Pacific, Shermans appeared on islands once thought unsuitable for tanks at all. And in northwestern Europe, as preparations for a cross-channel invasion intensified, armored formations accumulated in southern England at a scale German reconnaissance struggled to quantify. What intelligence could see only hinted at what was coming. German industry could not respond in kind. Air raids disrupted production. Skilled labor grew scarce. Raw materials were increasingly difficult to secure. Factories produced heavier tanks, Panthers and Tigers, but each one demanded more time, more precision, and more maintenance than the last. Replacement crews were harder to train. Spare parts became bottlenecks. Vehicles that should have returned to combat sat immobilized for want of components. On the battlefield, the imbalance translated into a new rhythm of fighting. American units attacked with the expectation of loss, not its avoidance. Sherman platoons advanced knowing that casualties would occur, but also knowing the advance itself mattered more than individual survival. Tanks were used to probe, to fix enemy positions, to draw fire so artillery and air power could be brought to bear. When vehicles were destroyed, their absence was temporary. German defenders, by contrast, fought with increasing caution. Each loss was permanent. Experienced crews were irreplaceable. A knocked-out tank represented not just a tactical setback, but an erosion of future capability. Commanders were forced to choose between committing armor now or preserving it for later, a decision that increasingly meant surrendering ground. The decisive shift occurred not in a single battle, but in the accumulation of outcomes. Operations that would once have stalled due to losses continued regardless. Breakthroughs were exploited immediately. Setbacks were corrected through reinforcement rather than withdrawal. The front became elastic for one side and brittle for the other. By mid-1944, as Allied forces landed in Normandy, the pattern intensified. Shermans were landed directly onto contested beaches, repaired under fire, and pushed inland within hours. Losses during the initial weeks were severe. Entire units were burned out in hedgerow fighting. Yet replacement tanks arrived faster than German forces could destroy them. Fresh crews took the place of the fallen. The line advanced, paused, and advanced again. Inside German command circles, the tone of reports changed. Language once focused on tactical detail now included phrases of exhaustion and inevitability. Officers noted that American armor appeared unaffected by attrition. The same formations returned after engagements that should have crippled them. The war, it became clear, was being fought on a plane Germany could no longer reach. What had begun as mockery of American industrial inefficiency ended as confrontation with its full weight. And as the numbers continued to rise, the realization hardened into certainty. The decisive moment was no longer ahead. It was already underway. The months that followed confirmed what German officers now understood but could no longer reverse. In Normandy, the destruction of individual American tank units no longer altered the operational picture. After-action reports recorded impressive kill ratios in isolated engagements, yet the front line continued to move east. Each village taken, each ridge crossed, revealed the same pattern: new Sherman units appearing where others had been lost, often equipped, fueled, and reorganized in a matter of days. By August 1944, the American production system was operating at full saturation. Replacement tanks flowed from ports to depots to frontline units with industrial regularity. Recovery crews worked the battlefields behind advancing forces, salvaging damaged vehicles under fire, stripping usable components, and returning hulls to service whenever possible. What could not be repaired was replaced. The distinction mattered less with each passing week. German armored formations, meanwhile, were shrinking in both size and capability. Panthers and Tigers that survived combat were increasingly immobilized by mechanical failure or fuel shortages. Crews abandoned vehicles that could not be towed or repaired. In many cases, perfectly functional tanks were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The battlefield, littered with burned-out machines, became a record not of defeat in combat, but of collapse in sustainment. Leadership decisions grew constrained by arithmetic: commit armor now and lose it permanently, or hold it back and concede ground. Neither choice altered the outcome. Even successful counterattacks achieved only temporary disruption before being met by renewed pressure from formations that seemed to regenerate overnight. The Sherman, once derided as inferior, had become the instrument of this pressure, not because of its individual performance, but because it was always there. By the autumn of 1944, the scale of the imbalance was visible even in German intelligence summaries. Estimates of American tank numbers, once dismissed as exaggerations, were revised upward repeatedly. Each revision brought a sharper conclusion. The enemy could replace losses indefinitely. Germany could not. The war had crossed a threshold beyond which tactical excellence no longer compensated for material scarcity. This realization shaped the final phase of the conflict. German offensives, including the last major armored thrust in the Ardennes, were conceived as gambles against time rather than coherent strategies. They relied on capturing fuel, disrupting supply lines, and achieving breakthroughs before American reserves could respond. They failed not because of immediate defeat, but because the opposing system absorbed the shock and continued functioning. As winter set in, American armored columns resumed their advance across the Rhine. The resistance they encountered was determined, often desperate, but increasingly thin. Behind every engagement lay the same imbalance, one side fighting to conserve its last machines, the other advancing with the certainty of replacement. For German forces and officers alike, the meaning was unavoidable. They were no longer fighting an army in the traditional sense. They were fighting an industrial process that could not be outpaced, outmaneuvered, or exhausted. And once that truth settled in, the outcome of the war ceased to be a matter of tactics. It became a matter of time. When the fighting finally subsided, the scale of the disparity could be measured with clarity. By the end of the war, the United States had produced nearly 49,000 Sherman tanks, alongside tens of thousands of other armored vehicles derived from the same industrial base. These machines had fought on every major front, from the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of France, from the mountains of Italy to the islands of the Pacific. No German armored vehicle matched that geographic reach or numerical presence. Losses were heavy. American armored units suffered thousands of destroyed tanks and killed or wounded crewmen. Yet the system absorbed those losses without collapse. Divisions that had been severely mauled in one campaign returned to combat in the next, re-equipped and retrained. The continuity of operations was preserved not through battlefield dominance, but through replenishment. The Sherman became emblematic of this logic, a machine designed to be lost, replaced, and returned to action as part of a larger whole. For German forces, the aftermath told a different story. Tank losses accumulated without replacement. By 1945, many armored divisions existed largely on paper. Units that once fielded hundreds of vehicles now counted their remaining tanks in dozens, sometimes fewer. Fuel shortages immobilized what remained. Training pipelines had broken down. Crews were rushed to the front with minimal preparation, undermining the qualitative advantages once prized so highly. Psychologically, the impact was profound. German veterans later described a sense of fighting against an enemy that could not be worn down. Success in combat no longer carried the reassurance it once had. Destroying an American tank provided no guarantee of relief because another would soon take its place. Over time, this eroded morale and confidence, replacing initiative with caution and resignation. Among the Allies, the experience reinforced a different lesson. American commanders learned that operational momentum could be sustained through logistical depth rather than tactical brilliance alone. The emphasis on combined arms, air superiority, and supply coordination grew stronger as the war progressed. Tanks were no longer viewed as decisive by themselves, but as components within an integrated system that rewarded endurance and consistency. These conclusions began shaping post-war assessments even before the conflict ended. Reports compiled by Allied analysts and captured German documents converged on the same point. The outcome had been decided not by individual weapons, but by the capacity to produce, replace, and sustain them. As Europe lay in ruins, the war's final accounting shifted from battles fought to systems compared, and in that comparison, the result was unmistakable.
In the years that followed, the Sherman became the subject of intense debate. German officers writing memoirs emphasized its vulnerabilities, often contrasting it with heavier German tanks they considered superior in direct combat. These assessments were not incorrect, but they were incomplete. Post-war analysis made clear that the Sherman had never been intended to win duels in isolation. It was built to function within a structure that prioritized movement, supply, and replacement over individual dominance. Captured German records reinforced this conclusion. Internal reports acknowledged that American armored units recovered from losses at a pace German forces could not match. Even when engagements were tactically successful, the broader situation deteriorated. The inability to convert battlefield success into lasting advantage emerged as a recurring theme. What mattered most was not how many tanks were destroyed, but how quickly new ones arrived to take their place. Allied studies reached similar conclusions. The effectiveness of American armored operations was attributed less to the Sherman's specifications and more to the reliability of the systems surrounding it. Maintenance units, spare parts depots, fuel convoys, and recovery teams proved as decisive as armor thickness or gun caliber. The tank itself was only one element in a network designed to keep pressure constant. This understanding influenced the evolution of post-war armored doctrine. Nations emerging from the conflict recognized that future wars would be won by economies as much as armies. Design priorities shifted toward standardization, logistical compatibility, and ease of mass production. The lessons of the Sherman echoed in later generations of tanks, not in their shape, but in the systems that supported them. For Germany, the war's end prompted a reckoning with assumptions that had guided its rearmament. The belief that superior engineering could compensate indefinitely for limited resources was discredited. The experience demonstrated that modern war rewarded sustainability over brilliance and planning over improvisation. The battlefield had become an extension of the factory floor. As the immediate post-war years gave way to reflection, the narrative surrounding the Sherman slowly changed. It was no longer viewed solely as an inferior machine that prevailed through numbers. It came to represent a different way of fighting, one in which victory emerged from accumulation rather than perfection. This shift in understanding carried implications far beyond armored warfare. It suggested that the defining battles of the modern age would be decided long before the first shots were fired. The Sherman tank was never meant to be a legend in the traditional sense. It was not designed to dominate through fear or inspire awe through technical mastery. Its significance lay elsewhere, in what it revealed about the changing nature of war. By the mid-20th century, conflict had become a contest between systems, not champions. Victory no longer belonged to the side with the most refined weapons, but to the one capable of sustaining effort over time. The German experience demonstrated the limits of excellence pursued in isolation. Precision engineering, elite crews, and tactical innovation could still win engagements, but they could not compensate for a shrinking industrial base. Each loss narrowed future options. Each success consumed resources that could not be replaced. The battlefield rewarded adaptability, but it punished fragility. For the United States, the Sherman embodied a different philosophy. It accepted imperfection in exchange for resilience. It assumed loss and planned for it. The tank's true strength was not measured in armor thickness or gun caliber, but in its ability to exist everywhere, to be repaired quickly, and to return to the fight without delay. It was a tool shaped by an economy that understood war as a problem of scale. This transformation altered military thinking permanently. After 1945, no major power would again approach war without considering production capacity as a decisive factor. Armies reorganized around logistics. Weapons were designed with maintenance and replacement in mind. The lessons learned from the Sherman extended into the Cold War and beyond, shaping doctrines that treated endurance as a form of power.
In that sense, the German mockery of American factories was not merely a miscalculation. It was a failure to recognize the future of warfare as it was being built in real time. When nearly 49,000 Sherman tanks rolled onto the front, they did more than overwhelm an enemy. They signaled the end of an era in which wars were decided by brilliance alone.